Medieval knights are usually sold to us as brave, noble, disciplined warriors. Which is funny, because a shocking number of them believe things that sound less like elite military thinking and more like a group chat run by concussed aristocrats. In this video, we're going through 32 knight beliefs so weird, arrogant, and flat-out ridiculous, they almost sound invented. Spoiler: they were very real, and somehow these people still got to wear armor and make decisions. 1. Deliberately fighting while horribly outnumbered. Nothing captures knight logic better than this masterpiece of self-destruction. The idea that the best kind of victory was one that probably killed you. Beating an equal force was fine, sure, respectable. But charging into a fight where you were outnumbered 5, 10, maybe 20 to 1? Now that was the kind of behavior that got songs written about you by people who were safely nowhere near the battlefield. For a lot of knights, glory mattered more than winning. A clever, low-risk victory was almost boring. A dramatic last stand, on the other hand, was pure prestige. This attitude helped create some truly idiotic military disasters because commanders sometimes chose the most theatrical option instead of the most effective one. In their world, dying beautifully could be worth more than surviving sensibly. Which is very poetic until the entire army is dead. 2. Refusing to fight on foot. A knight without a horse often felt like a CEO forced to use public transport. Technically possible, emotionally unacceptable. Their status was so tied to mounted combat that getting off the horse and fighting like ordinary infantry could feel like social death. And for some of them, that was apparently worse than actual death. Chroniclers describe knights who lost their horses and either surrendered on the spot or just stood there waiting for disaster instead of continuing on foot. Why? Because swinging a sword while standing on the same dirt as peasants was, in their minds, deeply humiliating. It was not just a tactical choice, it was class panic in armor. So rather than adapt, survive, and maybe win, some preferred capture or death to the unbearable shame of looking like a common foot soldier. Medieval arrogance really was doing full gallop. 3. Baptizing and basically marrying their swords. Knights did not merely own swords. They emotionally committed to them like they were starring in a very unhealthy romance. A prized blade could be named, blessed, admired, and treated less like equipment and more like a sacred companion with excellent stabbing potential. Some elite warriors even had priests formally bless their swords in ceremonies that looked suspiciously like baptisms, giving the weapon religious prestige along with a holy little boost in battlefield confidence. And then there were the cases where the symbolism got even weirder, with knights performing rituals that treated the sword almost like a spouse, as if lifelong loyalty to sharpened steel was somehow normal adult behavior. This was not a quirky joke to them. It was serious, deeply serious. Somewhere out there, some medieval wife probably had to accept she was in a three-way marriage with her husband and a blade. 4. Gout was treated like a flex. Only the medieval elite could turn a painful medical condition into a humble brag. Gout, which is basically the body filing a complaint against too much rich food and alcohol, became associated with status because it mostly struck people wealthy enough to overindulge on a heroic scale. So when a knight hobbled around with swollen joints and looked like walking misery, this was not always seen as embarrassing. Quite the opposite. It could signal that he lived well, ate magnificently, drank heavily, and had the kind of lifestyle peasants could only dream of while chewing turnips. They practically rebranded suffering as luxury branding. Instead of asking why their diet was destroying them, they treated it like proof they had made it. Imagine being so committed to class superiority that even arthritis became a trophy. Medieval nobles really looked at crippling pain and said, "Yes, this means I am thriving." 5. Red hair was suspicious by default. Medieval people had a real talent for looking at a harmless physical trait and turning it into a moral crime. Red hair got hit especially hard. It was not just seen as unusual, it was treated like a warning label. Redheads were often stereotyped as deceitful, angry, unstable, or somehow spiritually off, thanks in part to ugly associations with figures like Judas and Cain. So if a young squire had red hair, That alone could make people wary of him before he had even done anything except exist with the wrong scalp color. A red-haired knight might be judged more harshly, watched more closely, or quietly assumed to be trouble. Some medieval writers even listed red hair among the classic signs of treachery, which is honestly one of the dumbest forms of profiling ever invented. Your reputation could be damaged by genetics. That is not justice. That is horoscope-level nonsense with armor. 6. Hiring someone else to do your pilgrimage. Medieval knights loved the idea of spiritual reward. The actual inconvenience of earning it, not so much. A pilgrimage to a holy site was supposed to be a major act of devotion, repentance, and sacrifice. It was also long, dangerous, expensive, and annoyingly incompatible with lounging around your estate eating roasted animals. So wealthy knights found a loophole that feels almost satirical. They paid someone else to make the journey for them. Usually this meant hiring a poorer, devout person to travel in their name, endure the hardship, pray at the shrine, and basically handle the suffering while the sponsor stayed home. And somehow, the knight still expected the heavenly credit. It was spiritual outsourcing at its finest. Why struggle for redemption yourself when you can subcontract holiness like a wealthy medieval manager? It is the perfect example of believing that cash could solve even the problem of your immortal soul. 7. Throwing rotting corpses over castle walls. Once a siege dragged on long enough, knightly creativity took a very dark turn. One of the nastier tricks involved launching dead bodies over the walls with trebuchets. Not fresh bodies either. Rotting carcasses of animals and sometimes humans, chosen specifically because they smelled like the apocalypse. The logic came from the medieval belief that disease spread through foul air, so if you filled a city with enough stench and decay, plague or sickness would follow. They did not understand bacteria, but they absolutely understood that rotting flesh and human suffering tended to travel together. So they weaponized the smell of death itself. It was primitive biological warfare driven by flawed science and a terrifying amount of determination. Imagine sheltering behind your city walls only to hear the whistle of something airborne and realize the enemy has just catapulted a giant pile of decomposition into your neighborhood. Medieval warfare really had no off switch for horror. 8. Unicorns were considered real and extremely practical. For medieval knights, unicorns were not some cute bedtime fantasy. They were treated as actual creatures of the natural world, right there alongside wolves, lions, and all the other beasts in medieval bestiaries. But the truly amazing part was how practical people got about them. The unicorn's horn, called an alicorn, was believed to neutralize poison, which made it incredibly valuable to nobles who were naturally terrified of getting assassinated at dinner. So if you were important enough, you might own a supposed unicorn horn and dip it into wine or food, like a magical medieval safety tester. Of course, a lot of these horns were really narwhal tusks, sold by enterprising merchants who clearly understood the market. Still, knights were not daydreaming about prancing through forests with sparkly horses. They were thinking much more efficiently. They wanted a poison detector with horn privileges. Mythical creature, yes. Household utility also, yes. 9. Proving worth by jumping from a tower. Some medieval stories sit right on the border between fact and legend, and this one sounds like history written by someone with a head injury. According to tales that circulated, a would-be knight might prove his worth by leaping from a tower. The theory was breathtakingly simple and also breathtakingly stupid. If God wanted him to live, he would survive the fall and therefore clearly deserved knighthood. If he died, well, apparently, heaven had reviewed the application and declined. It was less a test of skill than a direct challenge to gravity wrapped in theology. There is no good evidence this was a standard knighting practice, but the fact that such a story existed and felt believable to people says a lot about the era. Divine favor was not just something you prayed for. It was something some people thought you could physically test by throwing your body into open air. That is not bravery. That is theology doing parkour. 10. Cleaning wounds with urine and rotten meat. Medieval battlefield medicine had a special talent for making a bad injury dramatically worse. One common idea was that urine could clean wounds because it seemed pure enough and was easy to find, which is true only in the most depressing sense possible. But the real madness started with poultices. To pull sickness out of the body, some healers believed you should place decaying material directly on the wound, including rotten meat or substances made from mummified remains. The logic was that the rot outside would somehow draw the rot out from within. So if your arm was already infected, congratulations. The official treatment might be even more decay pressed straight into it. Medieval medicine often treated symbolism like science and hoped the body would politely cooperate. It is honestly shocking the species survived long enough to invent anything. The cure frequently sounds like the disease was allowed to design the treatment plan. 11. Plunder was considered totally legitimate. Knights loved to advertise their honor, courtesy, and noble values, right up until a town fell and suddenly everyone turned into a heavily armed accountant of stolen goods. After a victory, plunder was not viewed as random chaos. It was considered a normal, accepted reward of war, almost part of the compensation package. Knights expected to take valuables, livestock, food, money, and sometimes even people as spoils. It was not a breakdown of order, it was built into the system. This is where the shiny image of chivalry starts to smell a little rotten. The same man who spoke grandly about virtue and courage could, within minutes, be elbow-deep in looted property arguing over who got the better chest or the last surviving pig. So much for noble restraint. Chivalry, it turns out, had a very clear class limit. It applied beautifully to fellow elites, and then vanished the second peasants owned something worth stealing. 12. The chastity belt myth. Few medieval ideas are more famous or more ridiculous than the image of a knight locking his wife into an iron belt before riding off to war like he was securing a treasure chest. The problem is that this is mostly nonsense. The classic chastity belts displayed in many museums are usually later fabrications, especially from the 18th and 19th centuries, when people loved imagining the Middle Ages as one giant carnival of barbaric weirdness. There is very little solid evidence that such devices were actually common in medieval life. But even though the belt itself is mostly myth, the belief behind it says a lot. It reflects the fantasy that human loyalty, desire, and trust could be controlled with hardware. That is the truly knightly part. Instead of dealing with relationships like adults, the fantasy solution was metal engineering and possessive paranoia. Medieval insecurity really looked at marriage and thought, yes, this needs more locks. 13. The vow of the pheasant. Knights were spectacularly good at turning ego into ceremony. One of the strangest examples was the vow of the pheasant, an elaborate chivalric performance popular in aristocratic circles, especially in 15th century Burgundy. At a lavish feast, a decorated pheasant would be brought out like the world's most dramatic roast chicken, and knights would make theatrical oaths over it in front of an audience. These were not reasonable promises. They were grand, impractical declarations designed to sound heroic, such as refusing retreat under absurd conditions, or taking on symbolic acts of self-denial until some glorious deed was accomplished. It was basically medieval public relations with poultry. The point was not smart military planning. The point was to look magnificent, committed, and terrifyingly noble while everyone watched. It was honor as live theater, where survival and tactical sense often sat quietly in the back, while vanity strutted across the stage wearing spurs. 14. Healing the weapon instead of the wound. Medieval medicine occasionally stepped so far into madness that it almost becomes performance art. One of the strangest beliefs was the weapon salve. If a knight got slashed by a sword or dagger, some people thought the correct treatment was not to focus on the injured body part, but on the weapon that caused the injury. The blade would be coated with a special ointment because the theory said the wound would somehow respond from a distance. This was a kind of sympathetic magic dressed up as medicine, the idea that healing one object could mysteriously influence another connected to it. Meanwhile, The actual arm or leg full of blood and infection might be wrapped in something filthy and left to hope for the best. So the sword received premium skincare while the human body just tried not to die of gangrene. It is hard to imagine a more perfect example of a culture that sometimes trusted symbols more than basic reality. 15. Plunder as a knight's victory bonus. Medieval knights could preach all day about courage, faith, and noble conduct. But once the enemy city was taken, the tone changed very quickly. Looting was not treated like an embarrassing side effect of war. It was often viewed as a deserved reward, practically a contractual bonus for surviving the fight. Gold, silver, food, animals, valuables, and vulnerable civilians could all become part of the aftermath. Commanders sometimes even encouraged plunder because it motivated troops and made conquest feel profitable, which is a charming little detail if you are a sociopath. This exposes the uncomfortable underside of knightly honor. They loved the pageantry of virtue, but many were equally attached to the idea that military success entitled them to strip the defeated of everything they had left. The battlefield glory was the advertisement. The looting spree afterward was the business model. Chivalry looked wonderful in songs. It looked much uglier in conquered streets. 16. Using animal dung as medicine. Medieval medicine had an extraordinary ability to examine filth and say, "This seems medicinal." Knights and nobles, despite all their obsession with status and refinement, were perfectly willing to smear themselves with animal dung if someone in authority claimed it would help. Different droppings were credited with different powers. Peacock dung might be recommended for baldness. Pig manure could appear in remedies for bleeding wounds. None of this was fringe nonsense whispered by one village eccentric. Much of it circulated as accepted treatment. The logic came from the larger mess of medieval medicine, where symbolism, ancient authorities, and desperate improvisation all mixed into one very unfortunate pharmacy. It is wonderfully ironic. These were men who looked down on peasants for being dirty, then trusted ointments made from literal excrement. Nothing says aristocratic dignity quite like paying good money to rub powdered animal waste onto your body and calling it advanced care. 17. The passage of arms. Sometimes a knight had too much money, too much ego, and far too little adult supervision. That is how you get the passage of arms, a bizarre chivalric event where one knight or a small group would announce they were defending a bridge, road, or crossroads for a set amount of time and would challenge anyone passing through to fight. It sounds strategic until you realize it usually was not. This was not about protecting territory in any serious military sense. It was pageantry with bruises. Participants built decorated camps, wore expensive armor, hosted feasts, and turned the whole thing into a highly theatrical exhibition of courage and social status. Think less military operation and more luxury violence festival. It was a medieval way of screaming, "Look how honorable and dangerous I am," while spending a fortune on staging. Knights were fully capable of inventing combat events that existed mostly so everyone could admire them for being aggressively unnecessary. 18. Believing heavy armor made you basically unkillable. A knight in full plate looked impressive enough to convince almost anyone he was invincible, and many knights absolutely bought into that fantasy themselves. Fine armor was excellent protection, no question, but some men treated it like a magic shield against consequences. That confidence could turn into tactical stupidity fast. A heavily armored knight might ride into dangerous situations assuming steel solved everything, when in reality armor had limits and weaknesses everywhere. Strong longbows could penetrate at the right angle. Blunt weapons could break the man inside without cleanly breaking the metal outside. Daggers could exploit joints and gaps. And if a knight fell into mud, deep water, or the wrong patch of chaos, that same glorious armor became a very expensive metal coffin. Plate armor was advanced, not miraculous. But medieval bravado often turned good equipment into a full-blown delusion. Looking like a walking fortress is great until gravity, panic, and a swamp have their own opinion. 19. Refusing to fight on major holy days. Medieval knights could be so committed to religious observance that it occasionally made them military liabilities. In some circles, fighting on sacred days such as Good Friday or Easter was considered deeply improper, even sinful. That may sound morally admirable until you imagine the practical consequences. An enemy force could use the pause to move closer, reinforce positions, raise siege works, or prepare a devastating attack while the pious side sat around trying not to offend heaven. And yes, opponents who were less concerned about Christian feast days were perfectly capable of exploiting that hesitation. Faith and warfare were tangled together in all kinds of strange ways, but this one is especially painful because it gave enemies a gift-wrapped tactical opening. The knights were trying to protect their souls and accidentally endangering their armies. It is a classic medieval problem. Moral seriousness colliding headfirst with military reality and somehow expecting reality to politely move aside. 20. Stuffing holy relics into their helmets. A helmet was already the most important thing standing between a knight and instant skull-related disaster. But for many warriors, that was not enough. They wanted backup from heaven too. So some knights tucked relics inside their helmets or armor padding, turning their battle gear into portable mini-shrines. Tiny fragments of saints' bones, blessed cloth, supposed splinters of sacred wood, and other holy objects were carried as protective charms meant to block blades and attract divine favor. Some even believed certain metals or blessed materials could help keep the mind spiritually clean during combat, because apparently sword fights also required moral air filtration. The idea was that physical armor and sacred power worked together. Steel protected the body, while relics handled the supernatural side of quality control. It is wonderfully medieval. A man charging into chaos with a lance, chainmail, and what is essentially a saint-powered warranty package stuffed inside his helmet. 21. Vegetables were seen as low-class food. For many knights and nobles, food was not mainly about health. It was about social hierarchy on a plate. Meat signaled power, wealth, and refinement. Vegetables, especially ones growing in the dirt like onions, turnips, and carrots, were associated with peasants and manual labor. They were coarse, common, and far too earthy for aristocratic self-image. A proper elite diet leaned heavily toward meat, game, rich sauces, and all the expensive excess that eventually helped wreck their joints and digestion. But that was almost preferable to being seen enjoying something that looked practical and nutritious. In their minds, you could not project dominance while casually chewing a cabbage. So they built an entire dietary identity around status, rather than balance, and ended up turning dinner into self-inflicted revenge. Medieval nobles really stared at vegetables, those harmless little bundles of vitamins, and decided that starvation of good sense was better than being mistaken for someone who worked. 22. Dragons were taken seriously. Medieval maps and books were full of dragons, and this was not always treated as decorative fantasy. Many people genuinely believed that faraway, poorly known regions might contain real dragons, along with other monsters waiting to ruin someone's travel plans. Bestiaries and chronicles describe dragons with the same confident tone used for actual animals, as if the world naturally included lions, bears, and giant fire-breathing lizards with anger issues. Knights grew up in a culture where dragon slaying was not just a cool story, but a believable heroic role. That mattered. These beliefs shaped imagination, fear, and ideas about unexplored lands. The edges of the world felt dangerous in a very literal, monster-filled way. It is one thing to tell legends about brave men facing dragons. It is another to sincerely worry that your route through unfamiliar territory might involve a flying reptile attack. Medieval risk assessment really included things that belong in fantasy role-playing manuals. 23. Competing over who could tolerate more lice. Some medieval stories are so disgusting they almost sound invented by an enemy, and the tale of knightly lice contest is one of them. The idea goes that warriors sometimes proved their toughness by seeing who could endure the worst infestation, as if hosting a private colony of insects was somehow a badge of masculine greatness. Whether this was widespread reality or mostly legend, the story survives because it feels weirdly believable in a world where hygiene was inconsistent and discomfort was often romanticized as proof of strength. Lice were common enough. Instead of treating them only as a nuisance, the tale reframes them as a test of endurance. The less bothered you were by crawling, biting misery, the tougher you looked. That is such a perfectly medieval form of broken reasoning. A public health problem becomes a character-building exercise. Why solve the filth when you can turn it into a macho competition no sane person would ever want to win? 24. Letting astrology guide warfare. Picture an army ready to move. The enemy is exposed, the conditions are favorable, and any rational commander would act immediately. Medieval logic sometimes had other plans. For some rulers and military leaders, astrology played a serious role in decision-making, meaning the stars could delay marches, battles, treaties, or major campaigns. If the heavens looked wrong, the army might wait. A comet, an unfavorable planet, or the wrong celestial arrangement could suddenly matter more than scouts, terrain, or momentum. Thousands of soldiers could be left sitting around because the sky had bad vibes. This was not just casual superstition at the edge of strategy. In some cases, it was woven directly into elite decision-making. The fate of kingdoms could be nudged by people reading symbolic patterns overhead and deciding Mars was in a difficult mood. Medieval war planning sometimes felt less like command and more like asking the universe for scheduling permission. 25. Urinating on attackers from castle walls. Siege warfare was cruel, exhausting, and full of opportunities for people to become creatively awful. Defenders in castles did not rely only on stones, arrows, and boiling horrors. Sometimes they added pure humiliation to the mix by urinating on the attackers below. This was more than desperate nastiness. In a culture obsessed with hierarchy and insult, it sent a brutally clear message. You are beneath us in every possible sense, and we do not even need proper weapons to show it. It turned bodily waste into a form of psychological warfare. Being soaked by enemy urine while trying to scale walls was not merely disgusting. It was an attack on dignity, morale, and social standing. And bizarrely, in a medieval world already convinced that urine had useful applications, this may have seemed almost practical. Their science was chaotic, their manners were dead, and their commitment to degrading opponents was impressively thorough. 26. Long pointy shoes. Proved you were important. Medieval male fashion occasionally looked like it had been designed by someone who hated walking. One of the strangest trends was the shoe with absurdly long pointed toes, known in some places as poulains. The longer the point, the more status you projected, because apparently dignity was measured in extra leather extending several inches beyond your actual foot. Wealthy men stuffed the tips with moss or wool to hold the shape, and in extreme cases attached them with little chains to the leg so they could move without immediately face-planting. This was not comic costume, it was elite style. Knights and nobles wore these things to signal rank, masculinity, and fashionable prestige, even though a staircase or patch of uneven ground could probably defeat them more efficiently than any enemy. Nothing says formidable warrior like being dressed for battle from the ankles up, and then sabotaged by your own ridiculous shoes. 27. Believing the king could heal you by touch. Medieval monarchy was not just political. It was wrapped in the idea that kings ruled with divine favor, and one of the strangest expressions of that belief was the royal touch. People thought certain monarchs could heal diseases, especially scrofula, simply by laying hands on the sufferer. Crowds would gather hoping for contact with the king, as though royal fingers came with built-in sacred medicine, and it did not stop there. Special coins or medallions, blessed by the monarch, were handed out and worn as protective charms because apparently holiness could linger like a rechargeable battery. It was brilliant propaganda. The king did not just govern the realm, he became living proof of God's support, complete with healing perks. For the sick, it offered hope. For the crown, it was a political masterstroke. Medieval power really said, yes, let us combine monarchy, miracle culture, and what was basically an expensive placebo into one glowing package. 28. Wearing a lady's underwear as a lucky charm. Knights loved symbols, rituals, and dramatic gestures, So naturally, one of their favorite good luck charms involved a woman's clothing tied to their armor. This was called a favor, a token given by a noble lady and worn by the knight during tournaments or combat. It could be a sleeve, a ribbon, or something more intimate, which makes the whole scene considerably funnier. Imagine a fully armored warrior charging into danger, looking like a human tank, while also being emotionally invested in whether the piece of feminine fabric fluttering from his helmet is properly delivering courage. The favor was supposed to inspire bravery, devotion, and success, wrapping warfare in the language of romance and courtly love. It is one of those glorious medieval collisions between violence and melodrama. Under all that steel, the knight was still hoping a lucky charm from a lady would give him that extra edge against getting smashed off a horse. 29. Bathing was considered dangerous. Medieval hygiene was often based on the deeply unfortunate belief that cleanliness could get you killed. Many people thought hot baths opened the pores and allowed bad air, disease, and corruption to seep into the body. So instead of treating bathing like a basic health practice, some saw it as a risky luxury or even a moral hazard, especially since bathhouses had reputations for vice and temptation. The safer option, in their view, was often wiping down with cloth, masking odor with perfume, or simply learning to coexist with your own smell like it was a loyal pet. Some even used grease or animal fat on the body, which is a remarkable choice if your goal is to feel human, but a questionable one if your goal is not to smell like a candle made of livestock. Medieval people really managed to turn washing into a suspicious activity. Dirt had somehow become the responsible choice. 30. Hyper-specific saints for every problem. Medieval spirituality often worked like a giant heavenly customer service department. Knights did not just pray in a general way and hope for the best. They appealed to saints with oddly specific specialties depending on the exact problem. Need help in battle? There was a saint for that. Toothache? Another saint. Skin trouble, illness, injury, travel, fear, disease, bad luck. Almost everything had its own celestial expert. It was not enough to ask for broad divine assistance. You were expected to know which holy figure handled which category, as if heaven operated with departmental efficiency and an excellent filing system. For knights, this meant spiritual life could become a complicated checklist before combat even started. Pray for protection, courage, healing, maybe your horse, maybe your digestive issues, maybe the weird rash under your armor. It is both sincere and wonderfully absurd. Medieval faith did not eliminate bureaucracy. It upgraded it into a supernatural network of niche specialists. 31. Left-handed people were considered bad news. Medieval society loved symbolic order, and the left hand got the short end of that arrangement in spectacular fashion. Left-handedness was often associated with bad luck, moral suspicion, and even demonic influence. The Latin root behind the word sinister literally fed that bias, and people took it seriously enough to shape everyday behavior around it. A left-handed person could be seen as unsettling or untrustworthy before doing anything except reaching for an object with the wrong hand. For knights, a left-handed opponent could feel extra alarming, partly because their fighting style was less familiar, and partly because weird superstition piled on top of practical discomfort. The prejudice ran deep. Tools, habits, etiquette, and even social expectations favored the right hand. Writing or acting with the left could attract suspicion that went far beyond ordinary awkwardness. Imagine being treated like a possible servant of evil because your body preferred a different side. Medieval logic was really exhausting. 32. Buying a pilgrimage instead of taking one. A pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Rome, or another holy site was supposed to be spiritually meaningful because it involved hardship, distance, danger, and genuine devotion. Naturally, wealthy knights looked at all that and wondered whether there was a premium shortcut. And there was. A rich man could pay someone else to make the journey on his behalf. The hired traveler, often poor but sincerely devout, would do the walking, praying, suffering, and surviving, while the sponsor remained comfortably at home, expecting the spiritual rewards to arrive by proxy. It was the medieval version of outsourcing your self-improvement. Why risk bandits, bad roads, and disease when someone else can handle the inconvenience while your soul still gets the points? This belief is amazing because it reveals how transactional religion could become in elite circles. Redemption was treated almost like a service you could purchase, as though grace itself accepted delegated labor and aristocratic convenience. So after all that, medieval knights were not just warriors in steel. They were also walking collections of ego, superstition, bad medicine, and spectacularly misplaced confidence. Now here's the real question, and do not play nice in the comments. Which belief on this list was the dumbest of all? And what insane medieval knight belief or habit did we still miss that absolutely deserved a spot here? Drop it below and defend your pick like your family name depends on it. And if you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more history that somehow gets more absurd the closer you look.